Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the U.S. Society of Ecological Economics, our latest seminar today, continuing our new series on putting ecology back into ecological economics. Today's speaker, we're very fortunate, one of the first people we actually contacted for this new seminar series is Martin Dovciak. He's an associate professor of forest ecology at SUNY ESF, Environmental Science and Forestry. He is very well known in his field, National Science Foundation Mid-Career Awardee. His research focuses on responses of forest ecosystems and plant communities to various global change and on the ecological applications in forest ecosystem management. He's also part of the Ecological Society of America, and we are very, very fortunate and grateful to have him today. As I said, one of the first people we reached out to, and very willing to do this for us. So we're extremely grateful and thankful to him. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for having me. This is a little bit different audience than I usually talk to, so hopefully the ecology will be available to forest economists. At the same time, it's really exciting to be talking to economists because there is so much need to kind of push the research ideas from ecology to other sphere of society, especially for somebody like me studying the effects of global environmental changes on forest ecosystems. Sometimes it feels restraining to just study the effects and not see changes being made so that we can actually protect these precious systems for future generations. So thank you very much all. Today I will be talking about forest ecosystems on a changing planet, and I'll provide a little bit of global overview in the first few slides, and then I'll focus on some of the research findings on trends that we are finding in forests of northeastern United States. And so what I will be talking about is a very much collaborative work across many students from my labs and postdocs, and many of them are recognized here. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. Also, thanks to many of my mentors, PhD and postdoc and others. Important, of course, is to recognize the numerous funding sources that made this work possible. So I would like to kind of give you a little bit of an outline where I'm going today. And so first I will provide an overview, kind of a global overview as an introduction to forest ecosystems. And then I focus on three stories that emerge from our research in the Northeast. So first I will talk about shifting climate envelopes and tree demography over elevation. Then I will talk a little bit about stand-scale tree seedling associations with other forest plants. And I'll eventually talk about fine-scale drivers of tree seedling diversity in montane forests. So I always like to kind of remind ourselves that we live in this world of twin contemporary crises, that of climate change and biodiversity loss. And these ideas really kind of inform a lot of research in my group. And so climate change is changing the way forest disturbance regimes work across the planet. And so we have increased incidence of forest fires due to heat and drought. And we sometimes can smell these in the air these days. So really kind of a prominent effect of changing climate and some other issues as well. We are increasingly experiencing erratic weather that leads to heat domes, like this one over here, shown in southern US last year. But with that, we also have incursions of cold air deep into the south, sometimes all the way to dry tropical forests of northwestern Mexico. So the weather is becoming more erratic. And that includes actually high precipitation events as atmosphere warms. We have larger rain events, larger storms. And this is a picture from, I believe, last year in Vermont. And the flip side of the erratic weather is the droughts, I already mentioned, but we have had a year of really extremely dry season. And this is a picture from the Amazon rainforest where all the brown in that picture really ought to be water. And there were some parts of the large Amazon rivers in the Amazon watershed that looked almost like a desert rather than flowing water. So large erratic events there really as a have a relationship to global changes in temperature. And so as the temperature increases, a lot of these erratic events happen. So everybody probably seen this graph showing global temperature anomalies relative to 1901 to 2000 mean. And so the blue bars starting from 1800s, mid 1800s, blue bars show cooler temperatures than what the average for 19 to 2000 temperature mean was. And then we flip mid-century, mid-last century to increasingly warmer temperatures above that mean. And the 2023 year, which is the last year that we have fully processed, was the warmest year on the record. The last decade was the warmest decade on record. So we are living, and the forest ecosystems are living in increasingly warm climate, not just erratic climate. And so the word is that when the 2024 data is complete, that we'll have a warmer year yet than the 2023. So the other part of the twin crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss is the biodiversity loss. And so this is the Living Planet Index put together actually by World Economic Forum that shows that biodiversity is largely in decline. This index has been first time calculated in 1970 and has been tracked since then. And so we have 69% drop in species from 1970 to, this is showing to 2018. And so this is from tracking a large number of selected populations of animals and plants, and they've been declining dramatically. So I will be focusing on forests within this context. And so forests are really globally important ecosystem type. They cover a lot of the terrestrial surface of the Earth, as shown here in the green. The green here shows the original forest cover. So this is the work of the World Resources Institute in South Dakota State University from a decade ago. But they have depicted here the cover, original forest cover before human agriculture and industrial logging took place. The scale of human effects on these original forests was quite large. So if you look at the current forest cover, it's much declined. Oops, what happened? Here we have current forest cover. I will toggle back and forth. You can kind of look in the northeastern US where I'm located. So original cover, much reduced. I'm going to point out to India also. So India, very forested subcontinent there. Not so much anymore. So there are small forest woodlots there. And so this is the similar situation across much of the planet. The issue with the current forest cover is that much of that forest is actually working forest landscape. So that current forest cover is divided into intact forest landscapes, meaning they are not actively managed. They still experience climate change and long distance pollution, some other anthropic effects, but they are not necessarily working forest landscape where active industrial scale forestry occurs. And so those are the dark green pieces on the map here. Working forest landscapes are actually predominant. So if you look at the pie chart on the left-hand side here, the primary forests, which are forests with anthropogenic effects from pollution or changing climate, but not necessarily touched by industrial scale logging, those are at about 36% of the total forest cover, while the modified but natural forest, so excluding plantations, is more than half of that cover that I'm showing here. So this is important because forest ecosystems across the world provide many ecosystem goods and services, just ranging from things like carbon storage that we talk about so much now. Trees include large volumes and large volumes of carbon. And so the deforestation would increase carbon balance in the atmosphere, and vice versa, reforestation can help with our issues in carbon warming up the planet. So protective function of forests is really important, especially in mountain terrain. Soils take a long time to develop, and so forests keep them in place. Important function of forest ecosystems is effects on water supply, both the quantity and quality of the water. And timber, of course. So historically, forests were used for timber. This is a picture from somewhere northeast, from Keene Valley in the Adirondacks, and we have certainly used timber to a large extent. It's kind of fun to see these historical images sometimes, kind of a sad fun, but we have certainly put a mark on those ecosystems by extraction. Increasingly now we think about forest ecosystems for recreation, so people like to hike and relax in the forest ecosystems. And last but not least, forest ecosystems harbor a lot of world's biodiversity. So tropical forests, for example, are some of the most species-rich ecosystems in the world, perhaps rivaled only by coral reefs in species richness. So I would like to dwell a little bit more on biodiversity here. There are some incredibly unique species. So I'm a plant ecologist, so I put up a few illustrations of just unbelievable things that live in these forests. So this is a picture of Titan arum from Western Sumatra. There is a little picture of one of those living in a botanical garden, Brooklyn Botanical Garden. There is a person here for scale. So these are the largest inflorescences in the world, have incredible thermal metabolism that I don't have time to get into, but it's just unbelievable kind of a plant engineering that occurred or evolved over time to safeguard pollination and reproduction of this species. Some of the oldest or most ancient flowering plant, Umbrella trichopoda of New Caledonia, is only in montane forests of New Caledonia. It's the species that helps us understand the evolution of flowering plants, right? So it's part of that habitat. Without that habitat, we wouldn't necessarily know about evolution of flowering plants. And in New York, where I'm based, there's small little critters that are extremely rare and sometimes worried that they might be going extinct, such as this small world pogonia. And so you can imagine a lot of different animals that might be really of interest. So on the left, I'm showing here spotted owl from Pacific Northwest that really informed a lot of changes in forest management because it was declining. And there are little teeny water bears on the left-hand side living in these moss patches that are the only living life form that can survive within the vacuum of the space. So we have a really amazing diversity of life within these forest ecosystems. Now, only a small proportion of forest systems are set aside to protect this biodiversity. So here's the global breakdown of forest functions. And so you can kind of see that the production is the largest piece on that pie chart there. And conservation of biodiversity here is much smaller. And the largest there is multi-purpose use of the forests, the second largest to actual production value of the forest. So this is sort of a global review of forest functions by Food and Agricultural Organization. So the issue with the biodiversity not being protected is that biodiversity loss has been linked to many ecosystem functions. So I mentioned that we live in the world of increasing erratic behavior of the climate system. We have disturbance events like droughts or deluges. And it turns out that species richness actually helps ecosystems to be more stable. So this is kind of a classic work on the left-hand side by Dave Tillman, published some years ago in Nature, and it's kind of spurred a lot of work on importance of diversity or species richness in ecosystem functioning. So what he showed that biomass stability of plant communities has increased as species richness increased in experimental settings. I have also looked at the effects of species richness, not so much on biomass stability, but on compositional stability. So what kinds of species live within the plant communities and how stable those compositions are. And turned out that compositional stability was also increased by species richness. So forests are really complex webs of biotic interactions above the ground. And so this might explain why species richness or diversity is really so important for forest or generally ecosystem functioning. So this is a kind of a compulsory little picture here of a food web that and stems out from a forest ecosystem. So there's levels of primary producers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, and there are very complicated relationships there. And so as we are trying to understand forest ecosystem response to global climate and biodiversity loss, it becomes quite complicated as there are many complex relationships. Just to highlight one of these relationships, deer is a really important herbivore throughout the northeastern US, but also throughout the world. And they really have massive effect on forest ecosystem structure. So this picture has been taken of an enclosure where deer was not allowed in part of the forest here in the upper left-hand side corner of this photo. And the rest of the forest where deer was allowed to roam, it looks very different. So you have forest tree seedling regeneration and all kinds of plants where deer can't access, but there are not so much many seedlings or other plants in the areas that are accessible to deer. So, but forests are also complex. We actually looked at this effects of deer browse on forest trees of New York State. This is a work by my former postdoc, Mark Lesser, who is now an associate professor at SUNY Plattsburgh in New York. And so this shows complications just trying to understand one particular effect of one particular component in that food web, the deer, on different tree species. So Mark looked at the effects of deer abundance index. So low level of index means low deer pressure, and large deer abundance index means large deer pressure. And he looked at tree seedling abundance responding to this deer abundance index. And it turned out that different tree species had really very different responses to the amount of deer pressure across New York State. So most species declined with increasing deer pressure, but some species had initial positive responses to some light amounts of deer pressure, perhaps as deer removed their competing species. And so this is just one of the illustration of one of the key components of the ecosystem, the deer, and how complicated it gets when it has very dramatic effects and different effects on different tree species regeneration. So forests are also complex webs of biotic interactions below the ground. And so this is an example of that, and ranging from fungi and bacteria and megafauna within the soils. And so again, so understanding forest response to changing climate is going to be also affected by biodiversity loss within the ecosystem. And so just to show one of the examples here, fungi, we'll come back to this later in my research part of the talk. Fungi really expand the ability of trees to tap into nutrients and water, and some suggest also carbon as fungi access nutrients and water, as tree seedlings, as depicted here, access nutrients and water, not just by their roots, but by associations with mycorrhizal fungal networks, which are much more dense, and there's more length there than tree seedlings have to their disposal in terms of their own roots. And so finally, I would also like to point out a little bit that the forest understory plant diversity effects on forest dynamics are often unknown, as resident plant understory species actually interact with tree seedlings as well, and they might affect the growth and survival of tree seedlings. So this is just a picture taken by various lab members showcasing a vast array of different understory plants in forests of northeastern US. And all of these interact with tree seedlings either positively or negatively, and can also affect response of forests over time to changing climate. And so here I'm showing the tree life cycle. And so I will be focusing in this talk on the initial stages of the tree life cycle. So seedling, which are defined here as small trees up to 0.5 meter tall. So they are kind of enmeshed within that layer of forest understory vegetation. They are really susceptible to things like drought or herbivory. And then I'll also mention saplings, which are larger trees, above 2 meter tall, and they are a little bit less prone to interacting with other understory plants, and they are more resistant to things like deer herbivory. And so the entire cycle of the tree life cycle needs to be considered to try to understand response of forests to changing climate and other environmental conditions. So what we have adopted in our lab group is the approach of observational study. So we are using the fact that plant resources and species distributions, but also biodiversity and interactions vary with climate, and climate varies with elevation. And so if you kind of imagine mountains ranging from the tropics through temperate through boreal zone, the vegetation zones on these mountains change depending on the latitude. So in the tropics, you have lush tropical forests reaching quite far up above in elevation as it's still pretty warm, and it gets very cold at only high elevations. While on temperate mountain, the vegetation zones are narrower, there is less species richness there, and kind of permanent snow and ice zone gets reached a little bit at shorter elevations, and that's even more pronounced in boreal zones. And so because the vegetation zones and distribution of plants across the elevations is so sensitive to climate, people have used mountains as a study system to understand how climate might affect forest communities, but also other plant communities. And there is a really excellent study of the work done in late 1800s by Alexander von Humboldt, early 1800s by von Humboldt, who mapped out these vegetation zones across the world as a first person and represented it. And there is a really neat work by Morweta Hulme, fairly recent, where they revisited some of the Humboldt's work actually. So this is a Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador on the left-hand side in 1802, when von Humboldt mapped out the vegetation zones that are depicted here. And they redid his sampling to try to understand if these vegetation zones changed as the climate has been warming on the planet. And so what they found out that the glacier limit has moved up between 1800 and 2000s. And so did the vegetation limit moved up. And so these moves were pretty substantial actually. So this is how vegetation zones on mountains are really informative, and I sort of adapted, and people in my group adapted this approach across the northeastern US. And so I will switch now to talk a little bit about our research in northeastern US. And I'll tell 3 stories, and all of those 3 stories are tied to climate vegetation monitoring network in this area. We call it ClimVegNet. And so what we did is established a bunch of plots across mountains in Northeast to study specifically transitions or ecotones between temperate, deciduous, and boreal forests. And so you can kind of see montane boreal forests in darker colors on mountain tops, and temperate deciduous forests in these lighter colors. This is a leaf-off photo, or close to leaf-off in the fall. Those browner colors are the temperate deciduous forests, and you can kind of see that the transition is quite sharp. There's some green boreal trees interspersed at lower elevations, but not really common. So sharp transition between these climate sensitive ecosystems, and the transition itself is very climate sensitive. So we have established our plots on 12 mountains in 4 states in the northeastern US, depicted here on the left. And we have set up these elevational transects, 5 or 6 of those along contour lines every 100 meters in elevation. And we also located some forest gaps next to these transects. Forest gaps have large effect on forest dynamics and resource levels, and so are important to study. And so overall, we have nearly 2,000 1 by 1 meter plots along these transects and in forest gaps across these 12 mountains across the 4 states. And we studied their tree composition, canopy openness, soil depth, and we measured also temperature. And so we have some interesting results in terms of the changes in climate and tree demography over elevation across these mountains. And so I will first talk about that. That's that first story. And so we asked, have climate envelopes shifted upslope? Is climate shifting? Can we tell that climate is shifting on these mountains over time? And we also attempted to quantify that. This is a work of Jay Wason, who was a PhD student in my lab some years ago, and he's associate professor now at the University of Maine. And so Jay looked at the ways elevation shifted of the temperature envelope. And so he looked at the temperature that is characteristic of that transition zone between the boreal and temperate forest. And he looked at past trends between 1960s, that's the oldest we had data for our region, and 2013, where we measured our own microclimate across these mountains. And he looked at the trends at maximum temperatures, Tmax, and minimum temperatures, Tmin. And it was clear that the temperature characteristics of the temperate to boreal transition that were characteristics in 1960s, these temperatures have shifted upslope by hundreds of meters. And so more so for the minimum temperatures, that's about 400 meter shift there relative to 1960s. So the climate typical of 1960s is now 400 meters above that in terms of the minimum temperatures. And in terms of the maximum temperatures, that shift was a little bit less substantial, but still it's over 100 meters. So from that, we have used IPCC's climate change scenario toward 2100, and we kind of simplified them to +1, +3, and +5 degree warming, and sort of modeled how much further that climate envelope will move in space on these mountains by 2100. And depending on which scenario, you can have more dramatic or less dramatic warming or move up slope of that climate envelope that's typical of the transition zone between temperate and boreal forest. And again, so more so for the minimum temperatures than maximum temperatures. And so you can notice some of these little diamonds on the left side of the graph, and these are the current elevations above the range limit of the boreal forest on the study mountains, right? So this is that ecotone. This is the elevation above that ecotone. And so you can kind of see that the temperature is moving upslope from the ecotone more so than the amount of area that is available upslope. So the conclusion here is that by 2100, much of that boreal habitat will not be available on most of the mountains. So some of them will probably convert completely to broadleaf deciduous forest, which will have implications on the various ecosystem services that vary between boreal versus temperate deciduous forest. So we have shown that climate envelopes moved upslope. And so the next thing that we were interested in is, are juvenile trees shifting upslope of their parental distributions following this climate envelope? And so if the juvenile little seedlings are moving upslope, then one would imagine that the forest is keeping pace with changing climate. So this is another chapter from Jay Wason's work published in Global Change Biology. And he looked at the older saplings here rather than small seedlings. And so these are bigger trees, but still juvenile. And those were not generally shifting upslope. So what he looked at is elevation mismatch, and which is a metric that shows if the seedlings are generally upslope of where the adult plants of the same species are. And so he looked at this elevation mismatch across number of key species of the northeastern forest. So American beech here on the left, sugar maple. These are the deciduous species of lower elevations. And then he looked at red spruce and balsam fir, which are the boreal conifers of higher elevations. And so the mismatch above zero shows that there was upslope shift, and then mismatch that is below zero suggests that there was a downslope shift. And so American beech shifted upslope. The saplings were generally upslope, but we think that this is more so due to mortality of the adult trees. There is a disease, beech bark disease in across the Northeast US. And so we think that that's rather the retraction of the adults that are dying of the disease downslope. And so it appears as if we had I see there is a question. Can we leave questions at the end?
Sure, we can keep them in the chat, and then
Yeah.
we can address them at the end.
So we don't think this is a real upslope shift of the saplings relative to adults, but more adults dying off at higher elevations. Surprisingly, the sugar maple and red spruce shifted downslope. And so we think that this is well, we have actually a model that's evidence for this downslope shift being caused by these species reinvading areas at lower elevations that were originally logged. So there's a rich history of timber harvest across the Northeast US. And timber harvest was especially focused on lower elevations that are more accessible, easier to deal with. And so we think that this is a successional dynamics, essentially trees from higher elevations that were not logged moving back to where they once used to be in lower elevations. And the last species, balsam fir trend, wasn't actually statistically significant. And so we had these variable shifts in elevation for saplings, but none of them were consistent yet with the changing or warming climate that we see in the region. Now, these are quite old trees. Saplings have established some decades ago, and so they were not really experiencing warmer climate when they were juveniles and thus most prone to things like droughts. So next we looked at the effects on even younger seedlings, and we looked at seedlings that are very small, up to 0.5 meter tall. So these are quite young. They all, or most of them, established within the last decade. And so this would be the last decade that was the warmest decade on record. This work is done by Jordan Tourville, who was the next PhD student following Jay. He's a permanent staff member now with the Appalachian Mountain Club. And so he looked at these very small seedlings for those same species, red spruce, balsam fir, sugar maple, and American beech. And what he found out is that actually boreal tree species, the red spruce and balsam fir, the high elevation conifers, these actually were moving upslope, but only in forest gaps. So forest gaps allow tree more light. There is a better growing environment there in terms of light availability. And so it makes sense that that's where trees would be positively responding to warmer climate, and they move upslope. We didn't see upslope shifts though for temperate deciduous tree species, which is interesting because that means that the boreal forest at higher elevations is moving up slope, but the low elevation deciduous species are not moving upslope. So that's a big question mark for what that ecotone, what that transition zone might look like. Some species are kind of abandoning it for higher elevations, and others are not quite moving in. So the next thing we did is we looked at the upper timberlines, and if these are consistent with these elevational shifts at lower elevation forests, This is also work by Jordan Turville. And he looked at historical data from a couple mountains in the Northeast. And so this is a picture of Mount Madison from 1915, where you can kind of see a lot of rock, and sort of light gray is the mountain grasslands. And then the darker colors here are the trees. And so you can kind of see that by 2020 in Mount Madison, there was a large expansion of the tree vegetation up the mountain. And so Jordan used historical data to kind of quantify these upslope tree line shifts, which are shown here in yellow. And for both presidential mountains, so that's Mount Madison. This area here is right here, this little yellow bit there. And he also looked at Mount Katahdin there. And so lots of yellow, lots of upslope expansion. So this is the upper timberline, so a little bit above where most of our monitoring occurs. And so these shifts were quite substantial. So tree lines have shifted upslope by 3 meters per decade. So for multiple decades, that becomes tens of meters on average. And the magnitude of this advance was variable, and it varied with tree line form, topography, and mesoclimate. And I'm not going to talk about all those drivers there, just to mention that the tree lines that are diffuse, so not sharply determined by topography or other abiotic conditions, those had the biggest ability to respond positively to warming climate, and they moved upslope most over the past 3 to 4 decades. So we looked at the limitations of what might be limiting the expansion of the temperate deciduous trees to higher elevations. Like I mentioned, the boreal high elevation conifers are moving up, but the low elevation deciduous trees are not. So we looked at the sugar maple and American beech again. This is the main species at low elevations. And we looked at 2 types of limitations. We looked at the mycorrhizal limitation and limitation by soil pH as a kind of a suspect limitations that might be preventing upslope establishment of these species in where climate is becoming more available for them. So I'm going to show these limitations for these 2 species next. So mycorrhizal limitation on the left side of the graphs, I'm showing root length colonized by tree seedlings, those are little diamonds over here. And on the right-hand side of the graphs, I'm showing the amount of trees that are conducive to certain mycorrhizal types. So these 2 tree species have different mycorrhizal types. And so sugar maple is relying on arbustral mycorrhizal fungi, and those actually decline with elevation, as shown by these bars over here. And so there's clear mycorrhizal limitation for the sugar maple, because as the availability of the hosts for the AMF mycorrhizal type declines with elevation, so does the root length colonized by tree seedlings. And so, like I mentioned earlier, these tree seedlings really benefit from these associations with fungi. And so at higher elevations where climate is becoming available for sugar maple, they don't have the right symbiotic fungi there. The story is different for American beech, where actually going up to higher elevations, the amount of mycorrhizal type, it's a different mycorrhizal type. This is the ectomycorrhizae. And there is lots of hosts of the ectomycorrhizae in higher elevations. Most of the boreal species there, spruce and fir, are ectomycorrhizal species. So this mycorrhizal type is available to beech. And consequently, the beech doesn't seem to be limited by the mycorrhizal. The root length of the beech seedlings that we looked at were colonized throughout at all elevations about equally, as shown by this green line here. So we looked also at the soil pH limitation, and I think I'm going to skip that through time. I'm not going to talk about the details, other that the sugar maple seedling species were clearly related. Their abundance was clearly related to soil pH, while American beech abundance of seedlings was not related to soil pH. So again, American beech is not related to, is kind of insensitive to soil pH as opposed to sugar maple. And so next I would like to look at some interactions of tree seedlings or potential interactions of tree seedlings with other plants. And so looking at the range of tree seedlings and looking at the range of understory plants in the forest. And so we have mapped out plant communities across this elevational gradient. And I'm going to show ordinations on the right-hand side here that show plant communities at each of these elevation intervals on the left that we sampled. So ranging from 500 to 1,000 meters with a transition zone in between there. And so for those of you not familiar with ordination methods, these are the way how to show multivariate changes in species composition in two-dimensional space. So each of the two axes is essentially showing a combination of species, and the points next to each other are plots. And if they are close to each other, they show that the species composition is very similar. And if they are far apart, the species composition is very dissimilar. So these are the study transact across the 12 mountains across the northeast at 500 meters. So these are low elevation plant communities. So these are quite close, these two data points here, and those are quite apart. So then we map the plant community composition at 600-meter elevation, and so it's moving a little bit up and to the right, and that trend continues as we look at community compositions all the way up to 1,000-meter elevation contour. And so there is a continuous change in plant communities that the tree seedlings would interact as elevation increases. So we have looked at the statistically, these changes are significant. This is all that says that. But these changes are driven by elevation and number of variables that vary with elevation, such as amount of conifers increases with elevation, amount of moss increases with elevation, precipitation increases with elevation as well. And on the other hand, a maximum temperature decreases with elevations, highest in the low elevations, and water vapor pressure deficit is lowest at or highest at the low elevation. So these are places that are warm and dry on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side of the graph, and we have communities of high elevation forests that are moister, cooler, and dominated by conifers and moss. So as environmental conditions change with elevation, so do these plant communities, and so there is a potential for tree seedlings to interact with very different plant communities. So as the low elevation species are trying to migrate or establish at higher elevations, they have difficulties they will be interacting with different set of species at higher elevations. So I'm going to mostly skip this slide in the interest of time, just saying this is, we have elaborated on the specific identities of species that are unique, particularly unique to these low and higher elevation plant communities. And then we looked at associations between tree seedlings of high elevation forests here in the blue, and tree seedling of low elevation temperate forests. These are tree species here in the brown, and we enumerated their interaction or potential interactions, so associations in space with these understory plant species. And so minuses show negative interactions and potentially negative interactions. There's a negative association in space. And plus signs here show positive interactions, so species of trees that are positively associated with particular species of understory herbaceous or non-herbaceous plants. And so the example here of negative interaction of balsam fir here is with a hobblebush. And so there are 3 negative interactions for balsam fir only. Sorbus americana is mountain ash at high elevations, has only positive interactions with several species there, one of them being the actual indicator species of high elevation species. And so this is just to illustrate some additional species of low elevations that had positive associations with some of these low elevation tree species. And so the main take-home message here is that the negative associations of boreal species with these low elevation plants, like viburnum here is a low elevation plant. This may be a problem if these low elevation plants move to higher elevations and may contribute to further demise of that species at higher elevations. The last story is the effects of environment and understory community on tree seedling diversity. And we put together this complicated model, and I'm not going to talk about the model. I'm going to show some interesting relationships, and these are pretty quick here and really interesting. And so first question was, what were the effects of elevation and canopy openness on tree seedling diversity? And so tree seedling diversity decreases with elevation. So there's negative effect of elevation, as one would expect. Lower, warmer elevations have more species in them. And canopy openness has a positive effect. So more open forest canopies allow more sunshine to reach forest floor, and that is a positive effect on tree seedling richness. We also asked what was the effects of forest understory vascular cover. So competing plants in forest understory had strong negative effects on tree seedling richness. But there was interesting interaction with canopy openness, where tree seedling richness was really positively affected by canopy openness, but only if there was little other plants growing in those canopy gaps. If there were other plants that colonized canopy gaps, they actually might have affected tree seedling richness quite negatively. And finally, we asked about the effects of moss. It was a part of that same model on tree seedling richness, and also on the effects of vascular plant species richness on tree seedling richness. And so tree seedlings were positively related to richness of other plants, and they were also positively related to amount of moss. So richness of understory plant community is important here in terms of supporting also rich tree seedling communities, which would then eventually support also rich or tree species rich forests. So I don't want to run out of too much time, so I'm going to fairly quickly go through these two interactions with moss cover. Moss cover was interesting also because it was compensating essentially for the decline in tree seedling richness with elevation. So where the moss was high, there was no decline in tree seedling richness with elevation. And if moss was low, the decline of tree seedling richness with elevation was higher. Right, yeah. I'm going to skip to this next one. And so the effects of moss were particularly exciting because another PhD student from my lab, she's a postdoc now in Germany, Monica Verdugo, investigated stress levels in tree seedlings. And she found out that tree seedling stress levels were much lower when tree seedlings grew on the moss than when they grew on litter. So the kind of stories connecting across different studies in the group. So we are kind of excited about that. So to summarize quickly, what we have found is that climate warming is impacting plant climate envelopes. And the characteristics of upper elevation montane boreal forests are likely to mostly disappear by 2100 from most of our study mountains. We are finding that young boreal tree seedlings shifted upslope in canopy gaps, although the oldest saplings haven't been shifting yet. And these small seedling shifts are consistent with climate warming, but there are issues with shifts in temperate deciduous species that seem to be limited by soil conditions and fungi, although it's species specific. And we are continuing to investigate the effects of understory plant communities on tree seedling richness and composition across elevations. And so the positive association of tree seedling species richness with the resident understory plant richness is really important because it suggests that maybe we want to conserve plant diversity for the sake of successful regeneration of species-rich forest ecosystems, including species-rich in terms of tree canopy tree richness. And so just some concluding thoughts here is that predicting forest ecosystem responses is complicated. It requires really systems approach. And so we have been trying to get at these different interactions with different components of the ecosystems. And so one needs to consider the complex relationships with biotic and abiotic, but biotic factors that are above ground, like deer and others, but also below ground processes are very important. And finally, one needs to consider the full life cycle of tree species, not just adult trees, but really the early stages of demographic tree seedling and sapling stages are really important. So that's my final thought. And thank you very much for listening in. And if there are any questions, I know there are some questions and we can talk a little bit.
Well, thank you, Martin. That was wonderful outline of forest and science forest, and gave us a lot to think about. I know I've got a couple questions myself, but we'll start first with the questions in the chat. And then if anybody else has a question, they can just raise their hand and we'll let them go. Alejandro, would you like to ask your question?
John, as usual, I am listening from Europe, and my son. It's evening already here. My son is around. I would bother you with noise if I if I open my microphone. Would you mind to read it for me, please?
Sure. So in the chat, Alejandro asks a methodology question. The ecologist Simon Levin once wrote, without an understanding of mechanisms, one must evaluate each new stress on each new system de novo without any scientific basis for extrapolation. As a biologist, would you be able to comment on Levin's quotation regarding the importance of mechanisms?
Yeah, so mechanisms are obviously very, very important. So we can predict what might happen. And so in ecology, we've been kind of through the period of very strong focus on experimental ecology, right? When you can manipulate factors and see how plants respond in their terms of their various rates or plant community composition, etc. So you can get at mechanisms. The real world is complicated, right? And I'm more of an observational person. We do use some experiments to try to get at things. But what we are finding is that in the real world, many different factors change at the same time. And so getting at the mechanism is a little bit more complicated. So what we do is we fit complex multivariate models trying to isolate both individual factors, but also trying to understand their interactions. And the full understanding is really quite difficult from experimental type studies because you can usually only manipulate so many factors at a time. So I think we kind of need both of these approaches, the experimental to kind of isolate the mechanisms and how do they work, but we also need to couple that with these real world studies where we kind of look at gradients of environmental conditions and how actual ecosystem properties, in my case, plant communities change relative to various drivers. Does that answer the question?
John, you have a couple questions.
So my first one is I saw a segment on public television, the Nature Show, on the pests that are degrading the real forests. Do you agree that that's a serious problem? And it does affect what you're talking about because it creates gaps, et cetera, such that the deciduous might move up.
Yes, so exactly. So the interestingly, the gaps were not really instrumental to help the deciduous moving up, at least based on what we are finding. And so we think there's soil and microbial limitations at higher elevations for the deciduous moving up. But I do agree that pests are really important. There is increasing amount of invasive species of various taxonomic groups. I mean, for forest trees, the insect pests are really important. But for tree seedlings, additional pests may be invasive plant species that are very vigorous and established in forest understories and prevent tree regeneration in forest understories. And this is particularly problematic at low elevation forests, not too far from human population centers. You get higher populations of non-native plants, for example, competing with native plants, including native tree seedlings. And so we do have a part of the study that we haven't quite fully delved into yet that has to do with the mortality of trees. And we have some understanding how mortality of trees increases with elevation, where it's more atrocious climate. And so kind of working on that still, although we are not looking specifically at pests, others do that, and it is an important driver for sure.
Okay, so my second question, essentially, I wrote it before the mechanisms discussion happened. So when you mentioned the relationship between the understory species and the the saplings themselves, I was asking about the driver of the interactions. Do you understand what's happening? Is competition important? Is attracting other species that degrade the saplings? Did you get any information on how that happens?
Yes, so we haven't gotten into that too far yet, but there is studies that suggest that with a more species-rich environment, there is a better use of overall ecological space, better use of resources. So there is smaller amount of resources available, and essentially it's a competition for resources as a consequence, right? So that would potentially drive negative effects of species richness on
The health of the
on
saplings?
individual tree seedling
Yeah.
species.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But the flip side is also positive relationships. So I didn't have time to talk about the stress gradient hypothesis, but that has to do with the positive relationships potentially or should be increasing with elevation and as environmental conditions become less supportive of plant life form. And so there has been studies showing that there may be more facilitative or positive interactions at high elevation plant communities where the competition is less important, but maybe it's important that plants kind of create microhabitats for each other that are important in terms of protection against cold temperatures, for example. So, but
Okay,
it did check out in our study.
all right, thank you very much.
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first, Martin, thank you for a terrific presentation. And I was interested in your discussion of mycorrhizal limitation, although it's in a somewhat different context. I live in the Piedmont of Virginia in central Virginia, which was predominantly forested but underwent a great deal of forest cutting in the early 20th century, and a lot has grown back, and there's now a big interest in sort of reestablishing forest blocks and in places building connectivity corridors to help preserve biodiversity. But one of the things I've wondered about in the past, and you touched on it in your discussion of mycorrhizal limitation, some of our landscape, or a lot of it, has been used, had extended agricultural use for decades, or in some cases was used for pine plantations, which are planted with pretty aggressive techniques. And I'm just wondering, in something like a Blue Ridge Piedmont area on the East Coast still, how long would it take, for example, for the fungi in the soil, the community of fungi in the soil, to redevelop so that some of the uh, originally existing species could come to exist there again? And is that something people are thinking about, identifying blocks of land for biodiversity corridors to try to assess before they choose?
That's an excellent question. And I don't have the answer in terms of the years. I think it's going to be very variable in terms of the kind of past agricultural use, some were more intensive than others, and also climatic zone and what's available in the surrounding area. Is the formerly agriculturally used area large or small, and are there sources just outside? So it's kind of hard to answer that with a hard number. But it's absolutely a major effect. We have across the Northeast, we have something that other people have termed arrested succession, where these old fields often do not converge back to forest. And some of it is caused by being colonized by these expensive herbs like goldenrods. But I'm sure part of that is potential mismatch between the mycorrhizal types. And so foresters, like practical foresters, have known about the importance of mycorrhizae for a long time and have been using it in terms of planting trees in places. And sort of surprisingly, sometimes the new science and the old science don't fully communicate to each other. And so we have, and partly it's because it's complicated. There's these big networks. And so as a research scientist, you kind of hone in on some small number of the small sliver of the picture that's quite complicated and look within that to understand like a little piece of it. And so the mycorrhizal limitations in terms of how they might be limiting tree migrations across landscapes have not been studied until more recently, although practical foresters certainly know about mycorrhizae being important for tree establishment, having actually used it by kind of mixing in inoculums in there when they were planting out seedlings. So important question, not just for tree migrations into higher elevations, but also invading back to formerly used agricultural fields.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. Appreciate it.
A question that builds on John's previous question, I guess. So you've shown how climate change is impacting the forest moving up. And I'm not suggesting this is a positive by any stretch, but is there any change in the ecosystem services like that the trees offer as a positive? Which again, not suggesting that we want this, but what is the impact there?
Yeah, so I mean the ecosystem functions will shift, right? So the easy it's not an easy question to answer, right? Because it has so much to do with human values and what kind of change are we willing to kind of accept and or adapt to. But an easy part is that these northeastern mountains are cherished by hikers, right? And part of the appeal is that you kind of walk up the mountain and you are in a different world, right? It's kind of cool. There's different trees there. They smell nice. The fir smells excellent. For those of you who are hikers, you know that. And so that would be lost. It would be just hiking like anywhere else, wherever you came from the lowlands. There is a suite of species that would be lost, and some of those species have kind of intrinsic values only, perhaps, or values within that ecosystem that's being lost. But other species have values for humans, right? So spruce has been important and is important in local economies, right? So not just the high elevation spruce, but also there's spruce at higher latitudes, there's spruce at lower elevations. And that's what was cut out originally and regenerated into deciduous forest. And so that move of spruce that I was showing, that was downslope of the older individuals, was spruce reinvading to where it once was. And so kind of further illustrating it's an important species for local and regional economies, not just for the ecosystem itself. Yeah, I mean, there's other subtle effects in terms of, that's not something we do in my lab, but other people looked at nutrient cycles, and there's always a worry if you have that this change might not be sort of gradual, just ecosystems move up the slope, but related to the question about the pests, is the question of the disturbance regime also. And so if you have a large, this change might be rather abrupt, and it may link to large outflows of, for example, carbon out of the ecosystem into the atmosphere, kind of making matters worse. So if you have large outbreaks of pests, or you might have system that's, our system is mainly dominated by small scale wind disturbance, so small gaps for most part. But that might shift to fire dominated disturbance if the climate gets warmer and drier. And again, you would have like an outflows of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, kind of making the warming worse as a greenhouse effect gas, right? So the worry is that these changes aren't going to be gradual changes, but that there could be effects, kind of erratic disturbances and effects, kind of far-reaching. You know, how we were smelling smoke a number of times over the past 2 years that came from Canada or all the way out from the Pacific Northwest.
Are there any other questions? Hey, Martin, do you have any last comments or that you'd like to make?
Well, I would just like to thank you all for listening in and for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you about this. I'm always excited about my research, and always kind of pushing myself to try to think about broader contexts, and certainly talking to you and answering the questions from a non-ecology group is really helpful and interesting. Thank you.
No, well, thank you. I mean, you made a complicated subject, at least for us, very easy to digest, and is very interesting and informative, and we thank you very much for that. So, and before we let everybody go, I just want to remind everyone that next week we have the economics piece of the forest seminars with Jesse Henderson, who I believe is online with us. He's a research economist at the USDA Forest Service in the Southern Research Station, and his talk will be Forest Economics in the U.S. South, Market and Ecosystem Dynamics. So hopefully we'll see everybody there for that, and there'll be announcements put out for that. So with that, I just want to thank you once again, Martin, for an excellent presentation, and for spending a little bit of time with us and educating us on forest ecosystems. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.